Hello, AP Psychology students, and welcome to Section 2 of Chapter 9 on learning. We're going to be looking at classical conditioning in real life. How Pavlov's experiment with dogs and metronomes or bells and meat powder and salivation applies to us. First, I'd like to apologize to the citizens of Zimbabwe for brainwashing students, high school students in a small rural school in Colorado to fear your country. I'm sure it's a wonderful place, and I've been doing this for like 6 years, and it was just the first thing that popped in my head. I got nothing against Zimbabwe, but I can't change. I'm not smart enough. So I would love to visit your country someday, and I hope that my students visit someday, and they're not afraid of your lovely country in Africa. So anyway, Pavlov did all that stuff with dogs. John B. Watson said, I can condition humans. I can do the same thing with people. And somebody said, bet. He's like, give me a baby. He theorized that classical conditioning could affect our emotions, our preferences, and even our tastes. And guess what? He was correct. And so we can learn to like things. We can learn to enjoy things. Our favorite foods, our favorite music, the favorite colors, even, who we're attracted to or what makes us excited in terms of the opposite gender or the same gender, depending on your preference, is really can be conditioned. And so classical conditioning explains why we get sentimental, why certain things just choke us up, like the end of Toy Story 3, and we're like, I don't know what's wrong with it. I just have something in my eye. Or Inside Out or things like that. They trigger emotions. I've seen people cry over commercials and things like that. And so our sentiments and nostalgia, which nostalgia sells, there's something about bringing back things from our past, and you put them in a movie or a show, and we get, and it creates positive feelings, and we get excited. And that heart rate increase and that warm emotion helps us like things. So we can associate with positive feelings in the past. If you go too far, classical conditioning actually explains why some people have fetishes, why people get turned on or aroused by shoes, or who knows, trees, because they probably associated their a memorable, excitable experience with shoes or with a tree or something. Not trying to be weird, but that's kind of the extreme version of classical conditioning in terms of why we like things. So if you have exciting music and it's kind of a funny video, we can't explain it. We just get excited. Like this. Probably smiling right now because it's funny. Even though it's really, really grainy and probably from like 2002, it makes us happy. You can even do amazing things. You can take a well-known horror film and then put in the right voiceover, the right music, and even key songs from people's past and make a horror film into, I don't know, a romantic comedy. Let's see here. This is really well done.
I'm outlining a new writing project.
He's a writer looking for inspiration.
Lots of ideas. Good ones.
Meet Danny. He's a kid looking for a dad.
There's hardly anybody to play with around here.
Jack just can't finish his book.
I don't want to sound melodramatic, but there's no way to make it economically feasible.
Here's to 5 miserable months.
But now, sometimes
Peter Gabriel does it every time. Just wait. Peter Gabriel
is just around the corner.
I'm your new foster father.
I'd do anything.
Climbing up on South Street Hill,
I love it.
I could see the city light. My heart going boom, boom, boom. Son, he said, grab the things I've come to take you home.
Shiny.
Forgot to mention really good editing as well. So then the opposite. So you can be classically conditioning for your likes, but also your dislikes. Things that we are afraid of, things that we fear can be classically conditioned. And so negative emotions can be conditioned as well. When fear becomes irrational or interferes with normal activities, it causes nearly a panic attack. Then it becomes a phobia. So this is famously Little Albert that John B. Watson classically conditioned to fear things that were white. And so what they did is they put like a little rabbit, and then they'd make a loud noise and make little Albert jump, and then they would do Santa's beard and a bunny mask and things like that. And so little Albert started to associate anything white and fluffy with fear, because they paired those two things. Little Albert, by the way, this is a very cruel and unethical experiment. He did have a terminal condition, and he died in childhood. And they never tell you that they counter conditioned him. They taught him to be to like white fluffy things, and so they reversed it as well. It's still cruel, and so Watson and his experiments are very controversial, and no way would they ever do those today. No IRB would sign off on it. So he taught him to fear rabbits and anything white and fluffy. The study ended early, so there was no chance for counter conditioning. My bad. I said that they did. I guess they didn't. That's my fault. I was hoping that they counter conditioned him. Like, please. He was terminal, and he did die early in his life, so there weren't long-term effects, if there's any saving grace. And so the way to do that is a therapy, I guess, method called systematic desensitization. So here's some things that kind of can teach you fear. The Marines. This is how the Marines use classical conditioning.
Historian Henry Brooks Adams once said, "They know enough who know how to learn." These Marine Corps recruits are counting on the truth in that statement to get them through the toughest 3 months of their lives. They must learn how to survive in a harsh new environment in which the smallest details of their behavior are scrutinized. They will have to change lifelong habits and learn new skills. In the Marine Corps, as in life, an individual's ability to learn can make the difference between success and failure. But how do we learn? What is involved in the learning process?
Some cool graphics from the late 90s, early 2000s coming here. Oh, yeah.
Humans are born helpless.
Aw, baby.
But dependence on others to provide for our basic needs doesn't last long. Perhaps because we come equipped to learn. But what is learning? The common answer is the acquisition of knowledge. To psychologists, however, learning has a much broader meaning.
Psychologists find learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior or mental processes due to experience. And what really the essence of this topic is are those last 3 words, due to experience. Because different experiences, different patterns of experiences lead to changes in behavior or mental processes.
Whether it's a child wrestling with a spoon for the first time, or a recruit in basic training, learning is crucial to the survival of our species. It is learning that enables us to adapt to our ever-changing environment. As we learn, we develop behaviors that help us to operate more effectively in our surroundings. And hopefully, we also learn to eliminate behaviors that hold us back. While some of the learning we do is intentional, such as taking on a new skill, much of it is not.
When my daughter was less than a year old, with infants, of course, you have a whole series of vaccinations you have to do. And the very first time that we went in for routine vaccination, everything was hunky-dory with our daughter, right up until the time that Paula, the nurse, who was wearing a white uniform, gave her the vaccination. Now, Laura just, screamed bloody murder. I mean, it hurt, it scared her, everything else, and she was, trying to get away. 3 months later, we had to go back for another vaccination. And my daughter did fine. We went to the pediatrician's office, and we were in the examining room, and she was just happy, happy as clam. And until, of course, Paula, the nurse, came in wearing this white uniform, and Laura screamed bloody murder. Now, Laura had become conditioned. She had associated this white uniform, okay, with getting the pain of the injection, the vaccination.
What happened with little Laura is an
Same
example
thing
of
happened to my
classical
kids.
conditioning, one of the most basic forms of learning. It describes how certain
Poor
stimuli
baby.
can automatically trigger a reflexive response. Humans have many reflexes. We shiver when we are chilly. We jump at a loud noise. Our heart pounds with fear when we feel threatened.
Ooh, hey,
These
whoa.
reflexive responses are involuntary, automatically triggered by a cold draft, the loud noise, or the growling dog. But we often have reflexive responses to stimuli that wouldn't ordinarily trigger that response, such as a nurse's uniform triggering fear in a child. Classical conditioning describes how this comes about.
Classical conditioning was initially discovered and studied by Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist. And his goal in his early career was to study the digestive process. And the strategy that he adopted was to study the behavioral reactions, the physiological reactions that occurred as something entered the mouth. His strategy was thwarted very early on when he found that the dogs he was studying became, in his words, psychics. He would take a dog and he'd food deprive it, and he'd put it on a little stand. And what he'd do is he'd blow some meat powder into the dog's mouth and study the salivary reflex. And after a couple of days of this procedure, he found that the dog, when it entered the stand, would begin salivating in anticipation of being fed. And at that point, his experiment was ruined because he couldn't study the reaction to the food. The dog was salivating as a psychic, predicting that he was going to get food.
After some initial frustration, Pavlov soon realized the importance of the connection he had observed. His very presence seemed to trigger an automatic response in the dogs, the salivary reflex. Pavlov wondered if the conditioning he had observed could be repeated with another, seemingly unrelated stimulus.
The story goes that Pavlov's laboratory actually lived above his laboratory. At that point, he ran upstairs and stole a metronome off of his wife's piano and brought it down into the laboratory. And as an experiment, what he'd do is he'd turn this metronome on for a minute or two, and then he'd deliver the food to the dog's mouth. And after several pairings of this metronome, which didn't elicit any salivation, wasn't a food object for the dog, pairings of that with the delivery of food to the animal, the dog began salivating to the metronome.
Before the dogs were conditioned, the unconditioned stimulus of food triggered an unconditioned response, that is, the salivary reflex. In other words, Pavlov's dogs did not have to learn to salivate when food was placed in their mouths. And under normal circumstances, they wouldn't salivate at all to the sound of a metronome. The metronome is a neutral stimulus. But when the neutral stimulus, the metronome, was repeatedly paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, the dogs began to salivate at the sound of the metronome alone. This neutral stimulus became a conditioned stimulus, and the salivary reflex became a conditioned response. There are many examples of classical conditioning in humans.
Oh, little
One of
Albert.
the earliest experiments was conducted by psychologist John Watson, who conditioned a baby to fear a white rat by pairing the rat with a loud noise. Eventually, little Albert came to fear other furry white objects, including rabbits, cotton, and even Watson wearing a Santa Claus beard.
That's a creepy mask.
You are now members through 1093. Series 1093, Company B, First Recruit Training Battalion. I will now introduce to you the drill instructors responsible to me for your training. Senior drill instructor, take charge of these recruits and train them to become United States Marines. Aye, sir. Again, my name is Gunner Sean McWilliams, and I am your senior drill instructor. I am assisted in my duties by drill instructor Staff Sergeant Villa and drill instructor Staff Sergeant Matt. Our mission is to train each one of you to become a United States Marine. A Marine is
Classical conditioning is a key strategy in turning raw recruits into Marines.
The purpose of recruit training is not to train a Marine for combat, but to train him to be a basically trained Marine. If I'm breaking down a misconception, where a Marine will be trained for further on for combat is when he leaves here and he goes on to specialized schools. What we're doing, though, here is preparing him for the discipline that he's going to confront at these specialized schools. How do we work the discipline in? One, instant and willing obedience to orders. How are we going to do that?
The first step in moving a group of independent-minded teenagers toward instant and willing obedience to orders is to trigger the reflexive response of fear.
You will always be at the position of attention, you understand me? Yes, sir! Wait, do you understand me? Yes, sir! You will always be at the position of attention!
Most people reflexively respond to yelling with fear. So the drill instructors yell at the recruits. In this case, yelling is an unconditioned stimulus that elicits the unconditioned reflex of fear.
Okay, aye, sir. Aye, sir. Let me tell you something right now. Who is going to take you seriously if you don't talk with some conviction? No, shut up. I didn't ask for an answer.
First, he's going to use a voice. Now, some of the way we get our responses, recruits don't like the shouting voice.
This yelling is paired with the neutral stimulus of the drill instructor's hat, the distinctive campaign cover.
We call it cover identification. For us, it's a visual identification that they're going to sit there and focus on because they know this cover represents the Marine drill instructor.
Soon, the cover alone triggers a fear response, whether or not the drill instructor is yelling. The neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned reflex of fear is now a conditioned response.
The recruits know that this represents a drill instructor. If I take this off,
looks completely
see
different.
me in a different light for a chance. When I put it back on, the recruits will respond and turn differently to me.
During the 3 decades Pavlov studied classical conditioning, he noticed 2 important variations called stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination.
Stimulus generalization is where you respond not only to the original conditioned stimulus, but other similar conditioned stimuli. So the way Pavlov did this with dogs, he could condition a dog to salivate to a tone. And then he could condition the dog to salivate to a higher pitched tone or a lower pitched tone. And the dog would salivate regardless of whether the tone was high pitched or low pitched.
Little Albert is a perfect example of stimulus generalization. While he was conditioned to fear a white rat, his fear response generalized to include other white furry things. Remember, even Santa's beard triggered this response.
Stimulus discrimination is basically just the opposite, where you respond to the original conditioned stimulus, but not other similar conditioned stimuli. So if we stay with the same example, Pavlov could condition the dog to salivate only to, we'll say, a medium-pitched tone, but not to a high-pitched or a low-pitched tone. The dog is discriminating between those similar stimuli.
Another example of stimulus discrimination would be if a Marine encountered a national park ranger who wears a hat similar to his drill instructor. Would he respond with the same fear? Probably not. The Marine would make a distinction between the 2 hats and the persons wearing them and respond appropriately. He is able to discriminate between the 2 stimuli. As we've seen, classical conditioning explains how we learn involuntary reflexive responses to stimuli that wouldn't ordinarily trigger that response.
You're moving too slow. Fix my record, sir.
But what about voluntary behavior?
All right, so I know it's a little long, but I think it is really good to see those in practice and kind of give you some different examples of classical conditioning. So we're speaking about how we learn to fear. So here's another one. Jaws, by the way. People swimming, not as scary as when you pair it with the music. And so you can use the music to Jaws to really scare some people. And for a long time, people did not want to go swimming, and they had a fear because of this movie. Now they show Jaws like in a lake, and you can watch it on a lake on an inner tube, and it gets you really, really scared. So the music does a lot to it, and those low-pitched tones kind of get your heartbeat going and all that stuff. If you've never seen Jaws, check it out. All right, so another one. You can take a childhood children's classic, a beloved Disney film, and through clever editing and cues that we recognize to scare you, we can turn it into a horror film through classical conditioning. Hide your children. Conditioned response there. So now, if we look at taste, conditioning explains why we dislike and like certain tastes and certain odors. Many people learn to dislike food if they became sick afterwards, even if it's not associated. If you got sick because of the flu, whatever you ate and possibly you threw back up, your brain is going to think that that food caused the illness, and so then you're going to have what's called taste aversion. So you're going to avoid that food for a long time, and it takes a while to get over that. It can actually, just the thought of a certain food can make you nauseous. This is also why when we see people throw up or smell throw up, we get nauseous ourselves because of classical conditioning. So taste aversion is a negative reaction to a particular taste that has been associated with nausea or other illnesses. And so this is also explains why people that are going through chemotherapy, cancer patients, one of the side effects is constant nausea. And so some people celebrate sometimes like, hey, it's your last dose of chemo. And they go out and have their favorite food, but then they learn to dislike their food because of that taste aversion, that constant nausea. It kind of rewires the brain to where you associate that food with that feeling. And so this is actually one of the reasons that they prescribe medical marijuana to cancer patients, as one as a painkiller, but also as try to get their appetites going and help with nausea. Animals learn to avoid sick foods that make them sick. That's why like dogs, when they need to throw up, they go eat a bunch of grass. Like I said about nausea with chemotherapy, and so medical treatments can do the same things. And so the placebo effect is going on here. Sometimes just getting some help, sometimes just going to the doctors helps us feel better. We associate the sights, the sounds, the smells of a hospital elicit responses, and we can actually feel better without even actually getting an actual treatment. So you can do the placebo effect, and that explains classical conditioning. A lot of it is placebo effect is explained to classical conditioning. And so that's why it explains that, and nocebos as well, and why so many people maybe have a taste aversion to tequila. So that's all I have. Next time, we're going to learn about the wonderful, wonderful B.F. Skinner, who previous classes dubbed the Hot One. Let me know if you have any questions.